Well, good evening and welcome to the study on the book of Acts. I'm your host, John Korkodakis, and good to see you here tonight. And happy Easter. We've just come through the Easter weekend. I hope you had a wonderfully blessed time celebrating the resurrection of Jesus yesterday. And, I was thinking in light of our study of the book of Acts, I'm really hoping that everything that we're going through and the details of the early church and how it celebrated the message of Jesus, I hope that just has brought extra meaning for you on this Easter weekend, and I hope it's a much larger understanding of the importance of this book and the proclamation that the early church made when it came to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So happy Easter to you all. Welcome. I'm really excited about tonight's lesson because we're getting into some really meaty things tonight. Not that we weren't before, but we're really getting into some interesting details about the book. And again, I just want to encourage you, if you haven't got your notes, the notes are pretty comprehensive, so they're going to help you tremendously in the study. So I hope you've picked them up. You can just go to my website, which the link is right below the pic here, and you can go to the YouTube studies page, find the Book of Acts, and you can get the studies for the entire study. I post the study notes, a few days or a day or two before the actual day, and that way you could be prepared and have them. So great to have you here tonight. It's really exciting as we get into it. So tonight we are looking at chapters 9 to 11, and so if you have your notes, if you have any questions, I'm watching the chat, so I'm happy to answer questions if I'm able to on the fly. But other than that, let's dive in, because this is huge. And again, like the stream, that's helpful a lot. And if you're new to the course, sign up, and that would help us out tremendously. Thank you very much. Good to have you here. So as we open up chapter 9 of the book of Acts, we come to the conversion of Saul. And you remember last week when the stoning of Stephen, we were introduced to Saul for the very first time. And Saul is the one that's holding the clothes as they stone Stephen to death. But, we're introduced to Saul again, and here he is on the way to Damascus with letters from, the religious rulers to be able to bring back and persecute people who claim to be followers of Jesus. Now, what's interesting about the conversion of Paul in the book of Acts is Luke, in writing Acts, actually mentions 2 more times this conversion of Saul, because it's such an important conversion in the life of the early church. Paul becomes an incredible instrument that the Lord uses, as we all know. And if you've been a Christian at any period of time, you know that he has significant impact to the New Testament and the number of books and letters that he's written. So this is very, very important. And what Luke does very carefully at the beginning of the story of the conversion of Saul is remind us of the characteristics of Saul. He's extremely zealous. This person is passionate. If he believes something, there is no stopping him. And he is just a firebrand when it comes to what he's passionate about and how he's able to communicate that passion and drive himself, purposefully based on whatever that passion is. So we're seeing that characteristic. And it doesn't matter what we're going to see in the transition of Saul is the same zealousness that he had as a Pharisee in training, is the same passion and zeal and zealousness when he becomes a Christian. And you have to wonder, if that's not the very characteristics that God, saw in him and wanted to use him for his purpose and for his glory. Of course, believers at that time are called followers of the way. Okay, they're not even known as Christians yet. They're not even known as followers or even disciples. That's not the terminology. In fact, in the Greek, it says any of the way. And it may very well be an allusion back to John, John 14, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That becomes, a characteristic name of the people who are following Jesus. So very, very early on, even Luke himself records that people who are followers of Jesus are known as people of the way. Now, introducing Saul, we're going to see that he has a repeated tactic for proclaiming the gospel, or taking the gospel to the people at large. And the vehicle he is going to use is the synagogue. The synagogue is going to play a big role to the missionary endeavors of Saul. So I just want to take a pause, and if you look at your notes, I've got this short little excursus about the synagogue. And most believers, at least that's been my experience, most believers don't really understand the synagogue. We kind of understand the temple. We know the importance of the temple, but not so much the synagogue. And the synagogue plays a significant role in the life of the Jewish people. So it is vitally important. And strangely enough, the term synagogue is not even a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word, meaning gathering place. And the reason for this is synagogues became popular after the exile, at a time period where the Greek language was starting to become predominant, and Jewish people and the prevalence of the Greek language across the entire kind of broad region of the world at that time was the lingua franca. And so they adopted this terminology as a gathering place because many Jewish people ended up being Greek speaking as well. And that's why we have the Septuagint, a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, because a lot of Jewish people were speaking Greek. So Jewish sources claim that when you build a synagogue, if there's a town that the synagogue does not exist in already, you try to find the highest place to build the synagogue. It needs to be prominent. And if you know anything about the way they built cities in ancient times, the high places was for the temples, the places of worship. That's why the most well-known one is obviously the Acropolis in Greece, where the Parthenon sits. That we treat that as very unique, but the fact of the matter is it was very common in the ancient world to have acropolises as a central place for the temples in every major city. If you went to Corinth had an acropolis. If you go to Ephesus, it had an acropolis. They probably didn't call it that, but there was a high place where the centrality of the worship or the deities that were honored in that city, and you could see their temples. Same with the synagogue. They tried to get it at the high point of the city, so it could be viewed. And a kind of general rule for a synagogue is it had to have at least 10 men who would participate and begin it. The interesting thing about the synagogue is it allowed men, women, and Gentiles to worship. It wasn't like the temple, because the temple was very different. It had priests and a place for all the different servants and people, and the Levitical priesthood, the sacrificial system, all the things that happened at the temple that were highly governed. But in the synagogue, even Gentiles could participate in one way or another. And they tried to get it to face Jerusalem. That's a very common component of a synagogue, to face Jerusalem. The service would include readings from the law, the prophets, sermon expositions, prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. Now, the interesting thing, because the synagogue was kind of birthed during the exile period, remember, the temple was destroyed and the people were carted off to Babylon, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. And so the temple, they had lost the right to worship in the formal temple and to do the sacrifices. So the Torah, the law, became, the kind of what replaced the sacrificial system. And that birthed the synagogues and being able to do this in the places of the exile where they were. And that's what birthed kind of like the secondary places of worship. At the front, there'd be this movable ark and the scrolls of the law and the prophets that were assigned to that particular synagogue. That's where they would rest. And they would be housed. And when the worship service would start and they have to do the readings, they would, open the ark, pull out the scrolls, and there was even some ceremony to it. In many synagogues, they would do a procession around the congregation with the scrolls prior to the reading. That was a common thing that they would do in this kind of processional. And often in front of the ark would be the people, the assigned chiefs of the synagogue is where they would sit. And there was even a seat of Moses that was part there. And I did forget my notes, didn't I? Thank you, Jennifer. I'm getting worse at this all the time, eh? Okay. There's my notes. Thanks for reminding me. I got carried away. But some had a Moses seat as well, and that would be for the head person at the synagogue, and they would call it the seat of Moses. And these were the learned men at the time. The synagogues were different in the fact that average people could serve. I did already mention this. It didn't have the kind of strict except for the top leadership. But in terms of service, it wasn't like the temple. It allowed the average person to train. And beyond that, it wasn't just a place to meet on the Sabbath. It was also a place that became like a community center. Schools would be housed in the synagogue. They would have some form of schooling. If there was a meeting to happen and they wanted to draw the community in, and they had a central place to meet, the synagogue often would be that place. And over time, as the note states, Judaism, there would be a big kind of conflict with Judaism, and Paul would start in the synagogues to preach the good news about Jesus, but eventually they wouldn't allow him in the synagogues anymore. And that's a significant thing. In fact, if we go through the book of Acts, there's only one place where Paul does not start in the synagogue. And there's going to be an interesting reason why they weren't able to start in the synagogue. But I'm going to get ahead of myself. And I don't want to do that right now, because that's a whole nother interesting component to the book of Acts, and very much what we see in the modern church in terms of readings, the sermon, the kind of worship that we have. A lot of it, you could make a case that it went back to the synagogue. That much of that structuring is emulated in the modern church due to the way of the synagogue. So getting away from the synagogue and understanding the place of the synagogue in the life of Saul as he's converted. But as we read chapter 9, we see that he has this Christophany, that he gets a vision of Jesus. And it's not just a spiritual thing, it's a physical thing. Like it's an experience that really overwhelms him, you know. And Saul's persecution is not seen against the people. It's seen as a direct attack on Jesus. Now, I think that's an interesting theology, and it's an interesting thing to take note of, that if you persecute the people of God, you are persecuting Jesus. An important distinction. It's just not the people that are suffering. Even in the book of Revelation, you know, it's acknowledged that those who are suffering as, you know, as Jesus suffered. There's a parallel there. So persecution is a direct attack on Jesus and everything that he stood for. So the encounter leaves Saul absolutely helpless. And we have this section, you know, the first 9 verses of chapter 9. We have, at the conclusion of it, we have Saul fasting for 3 days. And this is where he is left after this dramatic conversion. And it is a dramatic conversion. It is powerful conversion. And it just leaves him absolutely stunned and stupefied at what Jesus has done to him. So getting to the next part of the section, we have, beginning in verse 10, going on to verse 30, is Ananias. We're introduced to Ananias, and Ananias gets a vision from the Lord. And he becomes Saul's introduction into the fellowship of believers. And admittedly, Ananias is scared. Like, are you sure you want me to be the one to, you know, go to this Saul guy? Saul has an incredible reputation. Obviously, he is well known for his persecution of believers. Ananias is very aware. And imagine, you know, if you were the one that the Lord spoke to come and minister to this guy who's been known to actually target believers. The specifics of the vision and the quality, you're going to find in the writings of Luke, and I would argue in the writings of John as well, very specific points of contact in the way they communicate their stories that shows it to be an authentic experience, not just something that they've imagined, that they were there, that they saw it or they experienced it. And, you know, there's details that show that this was an eyewitness account or a very intimate account of what actually happened. So Saul's conversion, you know, paradoxically turns him from a hunter into the hunted. And he becomes a follower of the way, on the way to persecuting Christians and to bring them to harm. So this is an incredible 180 that happens in this person's life. And what happens is that the text says, almost like immediately is the implication, is that Saul goes and starts preaching in the synagogue. And here's the first indication of a pattern we're going to see as the text moves from the Apostle Peter to now this person by the name of Saul. And his preaching in the synagogue is so powerful that the Jews have difficulty refuting it. And what they do is they plot to kill him. Now, can we pause, right? I disagree with you. So we don't like what you're saying. So the reaction is that we want to kill you. Okay. We're very upset in modern culture that we have gotten to the place of, you know, cancel culture. But you know, if you think about it, we're actually reverting to an old sin habit that we have known for centuries has existed. If you don't agree with me, if you don't like my politics, if you don't like our nation, we go to war. We plot to kill you, or we plot to, annihilate you, or make sure you have no influence any longer, or you're not heard any longer. This is the ancient world's form of cancel culture, that we go to kill you. Okay. So this is very striking that this is going on, and this is the reaction of the Jewish people to Saul's preaching. So he is rescued at night, the whole story of being lowered by a basket. And Paul even mentions this in 1 Corinthians 11:32-33. This is etched in his mind. This is the first experience that he has as a person who's being hunted. And it's very powerful. So the tables have incredibly turned on this person. Acts 9:26-30 recounts Saul's return to Jerusalem. And some believe this section is the visit that is mentioned in Galatians 1:15-18, where Saul happened to be in Arabia for 3 years. Okay, there's a lot of argumentation between scholars about the timelines and the amount of space that happens, but it'd be very, very interesting because Saul is basically in confinement, and is being taught the scriptures in a brand new way that he can proclaim them. So this is a potential of what could have happened from the time of Ananias to the time that he shows up back in Jerusalem. And also we get reintroduced to this person by the name of Barnabas, who ends up becoming a key companion to Saul, a very important companion to Saul. And I would argue, because he's a son of encouragement, because he's got this powerful ability to strengthen people in their walk with Christ, that I think God intentionally put this person beside Paul to help him and to be the hands and feet of Jesus in many ways, and to help him in the journey and the work that God had given him. So it is a beautiful, beautiful kind of transition that we have going on here. Now, before I go into that last part, the end of chapter 9, we have a brief verse, 31, and again, it's another one of those summary statements that you're going to see Luke put into Acts every so often. He loves to give us kind of like an update on what is happening with the church overall. And one of the things that he communicates at this particular time, which is really important, is that the church is at peace. And it's almost an implication that Paul's now on our side, Saul's now on our side. So there's a sense of peace. Even though persecution is happening, there's a sense in which this conversion of Saul is going to give some kind of legitimacy to the church that the persecutors haven't seen as of yet. It talks about geographical expansion, not just numeric expansion, because it's starting to take over certain areas of the world. It's not just the Jerusalem incident any longer. We're starting to see it expand, and the fear of the Lord is a predominant aspect of it. Now, without spending a whole lot of time on that comes out of the wisdom literature. They are living their lives not in reverence of God, and a life that is obedient to Jesus. That's really what's being communicated here. That there's a sense of righteous living, that they've changed their lives to emulate the person that they're following. That's what Luke is alluding to in this particular passage. And interestingly enough, Luke talks about the strengthening and encouragement that is coming from the Spirit of the Lord. That's a beautiful kind of tagline to what you're going to see the apostle, like to see Saul do as he continues to start churches all the way around the ancient world at that time. Because what you're going to find is Saul is going to go back to these churches, and the characteristic that's going to be stated about Saul is that he went and strengthened and encouraged those churches. Really, really powerful continuity in the way that this is communicated. Okay, so yeah, I'm only on slide 2, and we've got 6 more to go, but there's a lot of meat in this particular section. So let's go to the next next spot here. As we get into, so we've been introduced to Saul, the big conversion of Saul, but we're not done with Peter yet. Peter's still an important player in this particular book. And we come to the place at 9:32 to 43 where Peter is key now, an important player in seeing the church expand to the ends of the earth. And striking that Peter is the one that is the first one that jumps on the Gentile component of reaching the world. But Peter arrives in Lydda, where he heals Aeneas, and in similar fashion to the man that we saw back in chapter 3, and Peter, interestingly enough, as all the disciples and apostles do, they claim that they've been healed by Christ. It's not a power that Peter has, or any of the other apostles have. That Christ is the one that did the work, and the miracle turns people to the Lord. That's the proclamation. That's a dual phrase in the Gospels and in the book of Acts is what we have seen and what we have heard. Those two in combination lead people to a faith in Jesus Christ. It's not, we've seen the miracle, but coupled with the miracle is the proclamation of the gospel. And those two hand in hand are what bring people to faith. That's a great question, Robert. Did Paul learn the gospel from Jesus at Mount Sinai? I think that's a great potential. I wish the Bible would tell us that, because could you imagine if Paul learned from Jesus everything about the scriptures, related to the law, etc., at Mount Sinai, and that was his learning ground, because that could be very, very possible. Or maybe he even visited the site in some way. But I think that's a great possibility. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Also, in quick succession, Peter is in Joppa, where he raises Dorcas, primarily due to the reality of believers knowing that Peter was nearby. Somebody said, "Hey, Peter's nearby. Dorcas is, in trouble. Let's get Peter over here." And Luke uses these stories kind of in contrast, really an important literary device that Luke uses. He shows the story of the healing of a man and a woman, the heightening of the healing. It became from physical healing to the raising of the dead. So it's like two bookends of healing. And the first invokes simply the power of Christ. The second is first met with prayer. And Luke is showing the contrast of the way Jesus is working in the lives of the apostles to bring about some of these incredible things. Now, both of these miracles result in people coming to faith and the continued spread of the gospel. So this is a 1-2 punch. This what we've seen and what we've heard is part of moving the church and growing the church and moving the gospel forward. And Luke is showing this pattern time and time and time again. Now, this is kind of a precursor to what's coming next, because now we're introduced to Cornelius. This is a significant transition that happens in the book of Acts. Okay, I would say Pentecost is a significant transition that happens in the book of Acts. And we've had all these other happenings in the conversion of Saul. Conversion of Saul would be another one. If you're going to do markers of the really big things in the book of Acts, Pentecost, conversion of Saul, this would be the next one. This would be number 3 if you're going to keep track in that kind of way. Because there's a huge transition that happens here. Even though Gentiles have come to faith, this one marks the beginning, the formal kind of beginning of reaching the Gentiles in a more concerted and powerful way. So Cornelius is a centurion. It's the highest ranking non-commissioned officer in the Roman army. So he's a significant player with a specified task. He'd have oversight of a century, roughly 100 men. So it's a position of authority and power. There's no doubt that this guy is very, very important in the ranks of the Roman army. And Luke is really good at including these stories that tell about the power of the gospel to reach anyone. This is, for good Jewish boys, which most of the apostles are very learned Jewish men, Greek background or not for a couple of them. They're steeped in the Jewish tradition. So Gentiles are treated in a very limited way when it comes to the religion of Judaism. But here we're seeing Luke talking very candidly about how the gospel has the power to touch anyone, to reach anyone, even a centurion. The first Gentile that Jesus dealt with was also a Roman officer. If you note, go back to Matthew 8. And it is one of only 2 instances where we read that Jesus was amazed. Okay, I can't remember, maybe a couple of years ago, I come to the realization there was only 2 times that Jesus was amazed, and I thought, boy, what would it take to amaze Jesus? And one of them was the person's great faith. This Roman officer that Jesus first encountered, and was amazed by this Roman officer's faith. And the other instance is in Mark 6:6, where Jesus is amazed at the unbelief of the Jewish people. Now that's a pretty striking contrast, isn't it? And you would think it would be reversed, but it's not. And here is another encounter with a Roman official that has powerful consequences for what's going to come next. In fact, Cornelius, we have this image of Roman soldiers, and Cornelius doesn't seem to fit the kind of rough, ready, arrogant, rude, brutal type of picture that we have of Roman soldiers. And as I've already said, the passage is a significant turning point in the progression of the gospel to the Gentiles, because it directly involves one of the greatest obstacles that the Jewish people have, the ritual uncleanliness of the Gentiles. It deals specifically with what's clean and what's unclean, and the Jewish people treating Gentile people as unclean, therefore unworthy of the grace of God. So, the conversion of Cornelius really does add theological weight to other parts of the scriptures. And one of them is the continued outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. You cannot deny, before the law, before Sinai, before the nation of Israel and Abraham, there was a covenant that God made with Abraham that he would make his offspring, multitudes like the sand on the seashore, like stars in the sky. And this would involve the entire world. It wouldn't just be the nation of Israel. It would be for the whole world. And here is where we're seeing the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant, because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, is going to be, as Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passages, be for the salvation of the world. And we're seeing this being worked out right here. So this is the proof that Jesus is fulfilling the prophetic mantle of the suffering servant as depicted in 53. And I think it is really interesting that it's Peter that's involved in the story, because Peter's got deep Jewish roots, and the likelihood of him having equally deep bias towards the Gentiles, as a leader of the church, is going to be a problem. And I think not only is this a significant movement forward in the proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles, but I think it's also a work in the heart of Peter. That this is another opportunity where Christ is molding and shaping Peter from the ritualistic elements of the law and the upbringing that he's had, and bringing him into the new community and helping him to understand the impact that the gospel is going to have for everyone. And I think that's just a beautiful thing that Christ is doing in the life of Peter. And the Holy Spirit has divinely orchestrated the whole event. Visions happen often, revelatory, coupled with prayer. Peter receives the vision 3 times. 3 times the vision of, the animals coming down, that these are all clean, that now God is proclaiming them clean. Same with the Gentiles. They are now clean, at least in the perception of the Jewish people. And it's a way of confirming the truthfulness of this vision. And Cornelius' reaction to Peter's arrival is that he falls at Peter's feet to worship. And Peter's response in verse 26 is, and especially verse 28, demonstrates the uniqueness of the encounter. It's a beautiful thing, and if you've read those passages, 10:26 and 28. But Peter made him get up. He said, "Stand up," he said. "I am only a man myself." And in 28, Peter says to them, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or to visit him. But God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean." This has to be a significant event, even in the heart of Peter, of everything that he's been taught from childhood. So this progression is vitally important in so many ways. So because of this experience and because of what's happening now, we have... Okay, am I getting ahead of myself here? Where am I here? Yeah, I am getting ahead of myself here. Okay, why does that not want to shut off? Okay, now the gospel moves to the Gentiles. Peter's speech to Cornelius serves as a time capsule of revelation, the religious and social barriers that have existed between Jews and Gentiles. We can truly see the revolutionary nature of the gospel at this particular time because of the way it's moving forward. Peter affirms the validity of the Old Testament and also in foreseeing Christ and the validity of Christ as the Messiah. Now, verses 44 to 48, show the Spirit coming upon the Gentiles, and for all the Gentiles that are present. And imagine the Spirit of God doing this. And once again, I would contend that there's a mini Pentecost that happens. Remember, we said at the beginning in chapter 2 that the major Pentecost, the life-altering event happens, the church beginning event happens, but all through the book of Acts we have these little mini Pentecosts, and here we have one. So the passing of the gospel into the realm of the Gentiles demonstrates without a doubt the impartiality of God and the confirmation of Jesus' words in Acts 1:8. Okay, so now Peter ends up back in Jerusalem. And what happens is that, amazingly enough, Peter has to defend his actions. This, and again, we're in a transition period. Many of us are just very comfortable at knowing that the gospel's for everyone. We've had 2,000 years plus of that experience. That's not necessarily an easy thing that was embraced by even Jewish people who had become believers. There had to be a time period for them to get used to reality of that particular truth. So Peter's having to explain his actions. The leaders in Jerusalem demand an explanation from Peter, and in verse 2 of this particular passage, they're not called Jewish leaders; they're called people of the circumcision. Notice the people of the way, and then people of the circumcision. There's like explained in that phrase are the two contrasts of the belief systems that exist. So part of the criticism that's leveled at Peter, he was even seen to eat with them. Therefore, the same issue that bothered Peter is now bothering the Jewish leaders. So this is very important. Now, if it hadn't been anybody else that had to explain their actions or convey to other Jewish leaders, what was happening, and for them to embrace it, Peter is also the great person that God used to be able to transition other Jewish leaders to this thing that's happening with the Gentiles. And part of the reason that's explained in the text that it could incite further persecution. You can include there's persecution enough. Doing what you just did could just incite more people against us. And that's part of the fear. But in verses 4 to 17, Peter gives this beautiful outline of defending what is happening and acknowledging that this is the way forward. It was God who initiated it. I didn't do this. God initiated this. And I'm not going to stand in God's way. Imagine Peter saying, I'm not going to stand in God's way. This is the same guy who tried to stop Jesus from going to the cross. Okay? So he's learned his lesson. He has learned his lesson. He denied Jesus 3 times. Here's a guy that says, I'm not standing in God's way. I was called, told to go there. God orchestrated all of this, which is really, really cool. And he says, I'm simply the messenger. I am simply the messenger. So don't shoot the messenger, kind of thing. And their experience paralleled what happened at Pentecost. You know how we've talked about this, repetition of the things that happened at Pentecost. And now Cornelius and his household experienced the same thing. And Peter witnessed it. Peter saw it. And Peter justified his actions because of what God had done. And they received the gift of the Holy Spirit. So without any doubt in Peter's mind, This is a turning point in the proclamation of the gospel and the movement of the church forward. And this is, if Peter had argued against this, God would have used another means or whatever. But Peter is incredibly pliable and incredibly receiving of what God has instructed him, and he becomes the messenger of what is to happen next for the church, and how the church is now reaching the Gentile people. Verse 18 records the acceptance by the believers of Peter's explanation. They recognized that this is the hand of God at work. We can't deny this. And the believers who now recognize Gentiles have the privilege of repenting of their sins and receiving eternal life summarize succinctly the nature and goal of evangelism. So, if there's a place where we could talk about evangelism being modeled, or the philosophy behind evangelism, I think this is the place to start. That everyone has an invitation to the grace of God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. So, even though other Gentiles have been converted, as I mentioned earlier, Ethiopian eunuch, the Cornelius episode is the breakthrough that opens the floodgates to the mission to the Gentiles. Okay, so I got just a couple more slides to go. Thanks for being patient with me. There's a lot here, so we've got a few minutes left, but I want to get to the church at Antioch. Now, Antioch's going to become very, very, very important. We think of Jerusalem as the center of, the expansion of the church. The reality is, Antioch is the center of propagation of the Christian message to the Gentile world. So this is a new kind of location that becomes central to the mission of the church. Luke reminds us that there are many unnamed believers who are fanning out to bring the gospel to the Jews. That is really cool. I think I said a couple of studies ago, that there's more people. It seems to be a natural reaction for many people who are part of the explosion of the early church, is that they start fanning out and telling others about Jesus Christ. It's such a natural progression. It's, I know Peter is Barnabas, Paul, and Philip. These are all people that are named within the book, but Luke tells there's many, many, many other people who are spreading the gospel. It's just really cool. So when you get complaints about there's a church on every corner, thank God there's a church on every corner, okay? Because that's just the nature of making the proclamation and reaching as many people as we can. So in Antioch, though a large number of Gentiles came to the Lord, it demonstrates that those who are spreading the gospel are serious, are seeing the doors open to Gentiles. So Antioch becomes this important place. Now I have a map in there, and that map's going to reappear because it's going to show part of Paul's first missionary journey, but it's able to help you orient yourself to Antioch. Barnabas is sent to Antioch. Barnabas himself, and true to his character, he encouraged the believers there. That's part of why they send Barnabas. They recognize him as being a person that will strengthen others and encourage other people, so they send him. He also sought out Saul. He intentionally sought out Saul. I don't know if in prayer God said, seek out this guy, you're going to get along with him, you're going to be able to partner with him. But, Barnabas recognizes the gifts that Saul has. And it's very possible, as noted in the notes, that Barnabas is looking for more help. With anything that expands as quickly as it does, you need more people involved in the work of the ministry. And Barnabas seems to be the type that, is encouraging other people to get on on side to help. And it looks like Saul, he identified the giftings that Saul had. And it's interesting that Barnabas isn't afraid of Saul. There's no sense in which that he's afraid of him, but sees him as valuable for the kingdom and comes alongside him. Now, in Antioch, this is the place where followers of the way, people of the way, were first called Christians. And many scholars believe that the term Christian was first a name of derision. It wasn't necessarily a positive label. It was a derogatory label. So, but here in Antioch is where they were first called Christians, not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, but in Antioch. That's where believers were first called Christian. Now, you're going to get confused when you read the book of Acts because there's two Antiochs. There's not just one. It's just part of the idiosyncrasies that we have. But I think I've got a chart here. Yeah. But here's the chart. Let me shrink my my picture a little bit, if I can. Oh, just want to move it over a little bit. It won't allow me to move over it for some reason, but anyway. Oh, because I have it locked. That's why. Sorry about that. Now, there's two Antiochs. This is Antioch in Syria that we're talking about, where believers were first called Christians. But there's an Antioch in Pisidia as well. And I have a chart there talking about the different Antiochs, and you'll see that, Antioch at the time was the third largest city after Rome and Alexandria. So it's a huge metropolis. It's, comparatively speaking, probably 500 to 800,000, people at the time. So this is not a small town. This is a huge metropolis, Roman metropolis. Okay, so the one in Syria is a central place. It's the capital of the Roman province that it exists in. As I said, it's the central hub for the spread of Christianity. Paul lived and taught there for 14 years. And, we're going to talk about, different books where Paul possibly wrote, some of the epistles and other things. There's some scholars that believe that this became a place where at least some of the books of Paul's writings were at least initiated. Many believe that the Gospel of Matthew was actually written here. So this is a very important place. Now, in the Antioch in Pisidia, we're going to be introduced to it in the book of Acts as well. And it becomes a main stop in Paul's first missionary journey. It's mentioned only in passing in the New Testament, but it also was a thriving Roman city, but much smaller than Antioch in Syria. Paul's first recorded sermon is preached in Antioch of Pisidia, and Paul's letter to the Galatians would have also included this city as part of the circulation of that letter being read in different churches. And Paul suffered abuse in this. He actually mentions abuse that he suffered. Yes, Robert, there's a London in England too. It's kind of a little shanty town, but there is one there too. So there's two Antiochs, and you'll see on the map their location. But the prophetic gift is once again featured when Barnabas goes to Antioch in Syria. A group who identifies themselves as such arrive in Antioch. This is the group where there's a prophet by the name of Agabus that shows up, and he makes a prediction about an upcoming famine that's going to happen, that he's warning Christians about. And what is interesting, though, is the action that's taken by the church. When you read the text really carefully, they gave generously and with full anticipation of what Agabus was saying as a prophecy about the famine, that they acted in certainty of that prophecy coming to bear. And that's how they responded. They got themselves ready for this, that this that this drought that was going to come was going to happen. So in conclusion, in looking at Barnabas and Saul gathering together, here are some of the conclusions that we can make. This has been a huge section. We've had to go through it as quickly as possible. But entrusting the gifts to Barnabas and Saul, here's what we can deduce. The missionary spirit of the church is incredibly vibrant. And it is, from the very birth of the church, a prominent feature in the church. We talk about evangelism, but the reality is probably more succinct to talk about the missionary endeavor, the reaching out of other people. Evangelism can sound very local, where I think in Acts, God is moving the church constantly out to new horizons, new nations, new people on a continual basis. If evangelism was seen as just your local neighborhood, then we would not probably have the explosion of the church the way we did. And again, that's all providential and the sovereignty work of God. I understand that. But there's the mindset that is dramatically, I think, prominent within the early church. And the church, not only that, but sees itself responsible for other believers. It's not like, you can hold your own, it's you and God, etc., etc. But they feel a sense of responsibility to other believers. The care, the generosity aspect is very, very prevalent in the book of Acts. And again, that's the generosity quotient. It's a hallmark of the new community. This is a time where, the wealthy are the minority, as they are today, and they lord it over people, etc., etc. But generosity across the board becomes another hallmark of the early church. And in coming to the end of Acts 11:30, of this section, we see that elders are mentioned. Now, elders has a very distinct connotation biblically in the New Testament sense. And what I find very interesting is we hear that the early church was very loosey-goosey, house-oriented, very horizontal in its management system. I personally don't see that. In fact, there are implications throughout the book of Acts that there is structure, order, that leaders are being identified, that the tasks are being given to people as areas of responsibility, that it's not as unstructured as we like to think. And people are being identified in terms of eldership as overseers of, whatever, like house churches or a group of people, that there is a sense of authority and structure, but authority in the name of Christ as servant leaders, not in a power model mode, but in a servant leadership role. So that's an important distinction to make right out of the gate here. Okay, I think that's everything I've got tonight. That was a lot of stuff, and here we are. We're at the end of our time. I hope you've enjoyed chapters 9 to 11. Take a chance again to read through them, and hopefully with these notes and some of the things that we've learned tonight, it's going to initiate some deeper understanding of some of the things in this text. But thank you for being here, and I hope you've been blessed, and I hope you've learned something about the book of Acts that's been new to you, and just encourage you to keep reading, keep diving into the text. Continue to be blessed by everything that you're learning. And again, I want to wish everybody a happy Easter weekend. God bless you as we catch you next week as we dive into, I think, 12, 13, and 14, I think it is, the next 3 chapters. Okay? God bless you. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week.